When the world goes silent, something louder begins to speak. The mind. It whispers doubts, questions, and sometimes truths no one else dares to say. Most people run from that silence. They try to fill it with noise, people, distractions. But the ones who don't, the ones who stay and listen, they become unshakable. Being alone is not a punishment, it's an invitation. To meet the parts of yourself no crowd can reflect back to you. To discover a strength that doesn't ask for applause. Stoics knew this well. In solitude, they forged clarity, discipline, and power. This isn't about surviving loneliness, it's about thriving in it. About walking into the quiet with nothing but your breath and coming out with everything you need. The room doesn't change when everyone leaves. The walls remain the same color, the furniture holds its position, the air moves with the same invisible currents. But something fundamental shifts in the space between your heartbeat and your breath. Something that has nothing to do with the physical world and everything to do with the architecture of your mind. You notice it first in the quality of sound, not the absence of voices or footsteps, but the presence of something else, a thickness in the air that seems to press against your eardrums. The hum of the refrigerator becomes louder. The tick of a clock you never noticed suddenly marks time with the precision of a metronome. Your own breathing, once unconscious, now demands attention like an uninvited guest. This is the moment when the external world stops providing its familiar soundtrack, and your internal world begins to play its hidden orchestra. Most people don't realize how much noise lives inside them until the outside goes quiet. Thoughts that were once background static suddenly move to center stage, demanding an audience of one. You sit in this newfound silence, and within minutes, sometimes seconds, the discomfort begins. It starts as a subtle restlessness, a feeling that something is missing, that you should be doing something, talking to someone, filling the space with activity. Your phone becomes heavier in your pocket. The urge to check messages, scroll through feeds, call someone, anyone, grows stronger with each passing moment. But why? Why does the simple absence of others feel like a threat to your very existence? The ancient Stoics understood this phenomenon with startling clarity. They recognized that most human suffering stems not from external circumstances, but from our resistance to being alone with our own thoughts. Epictetus, who spent years in physical chains, wrote extensively about the invisible chains we forge in our minds, the dependencies we create that make solitude feel like exile rather than sovereignty. When you are alone, your mind reveals its architecture. The carefully constructed narratives you tell yourself about who you are, what you're worth, and where you belong in the world. These stories suddenly lack their usual supporting cast. Without others to reflect your identity back to you, without the constant feedback loop of social interaction, you're left with the raw material of selfhood. And that raw material is often messier than you expected. The thoughts that emerge in silence are rarely the polished, reasonable ones you present to the world. They're the unedited versions, the doubts, the fears, the questions you've been too busy to address. They surface like debris after a storm, floating in the still water of your consciousness, demanding to be acknowledged. Am I enough? Surfaces first, usually. Not the casual social version of this question, but the deep, existential core of it. Am I enough without an audience? Am I enough without validation? Am I enough just as I am, in this moment, with no one watching? The discomfort you feel in solitude isn't really about being alone. It's about being forced to confront the parts of yourself that you've been outsourcing to others. Your sense of worth, your understanding of your own value, your belief in your capabilities. How much of this depends on external confirmation? Most people have never learned to be good company for themselves. They've mastered the art of being entertaining, supportive, or useful to others, but they've never developed the skill of sitting with their own thoughts without judgment, without the need to perform or prove anything. This is where the sudden silence becomes a teacher rather than a tormentor. The Stoics practiced something they called prosocia, a continuous attention to the present moment and to one's inner state. They understood that solitude wasn't something to be endured, but something to be cultivated. It was in the quiet moments, away from the opinions and expectations of others, that they could see themselves clearly. Marcus Aurelius, despite being the most powerful man in the world, wrote his most profound insights not in public speeches, but in private reflections. His meditations were never intended for an audience. They were conversations with himself, conducted in the sanctuary of solitude. He understood that true wisdom emerges not from debate or discussion, but from the honest examination of one's own thoughts and motivations. When you first encounter this sudden silence, your instinct is to fill it, to reach for your phone, turn on music, call a friend, start a project, anything to avoid the raw encounter with your unfiltered self. But this instinct, while natural, is also a form of spiritual cowardice. It's the refusal to meet yourself on your own terms. The silence isn't empty. It's full of possibilities, full of truths you've been too distracted to notice, full of strength you didn't know you possessed. But accessing this fullness requires a kind of courage that our culture rarely teaches, the courage to be unwitnessed, unvalidated, uncommented upon. In this sudden silence, you begin to understand that you've been living much of your life as if you were on stage, always aware of an audience, always adjusting your performance based on their reactions. The quiet reveals how exhausting this has been, how much energy you've spent trying to be the person you think others want you to be. But who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when there's no one to impress, no one to please, no one to prove anything to? This question, uncomfortable as it may be, is the beginning of all genuine self-knowledge. The sudden silence, then, is not an ending, but a beginning. It's the moment when you stop being a character in other people's stories and start becoming the author of your own. It's the first step toward discovering that you don't need anyone else to validate your existence, that you are, in fact, enough, just as you are, in the quiet sanctuary of your own presence. The silence is waiting. The question is, will you listen? There's a word in the English language that has been corrupted by centuries of misunderstanding. The word is alone, and somewhere along the way, it became synonymous with lonely. But these two states of being are as different as hunger and fasting, as different as being lost and choosing your own path. Loneliness is a wound. Aloneness is a choice. When you feel lonely, you experience yourself as incomplete, as if some essential part of your being has been severed and exists somewhere else, in someone else's presence. Loneliness is the ache of absence, the feeling that you are half of a conversation that no one else is participating in. It's the emotional equivalent of reaching for something that isn't there, over and over again. But aloneness, true aloneness, is sovereignty. It's the recognition that you are whole unto yourself, that your completeness doesn't depend on anyone else's presence or approval. It's the difference between feeling like you're waiting for your life to begin and understanding that your life is happening right now, in this moment, with or without witnesses. The confusion between these two states has created a culture of people who are terrified of their own company. They mistake the temporary discomfort of adjustment to solitude for the chronic pain of loneliness. They flee from moments of quiet reflection, convinced that being alone means being rejected, abandoned, or somehow insufficient. But consider this: some of the most profound moments in human history have emerged from aloneness, not from loneliness. The Buddha found enlightenment sitting alone under a tree. Jesus retreated to the wilderness for 40 days. Virginia Woolf wrote about needing a room of one's own. These weren't acts of desperation born from loneliness. They were deliberate choices to seek truth in solitude. The Stoics understood this distinction with remarkable clarity. They recognized that loneliness is rooted in attachment, specifically in the attachment to outcomes that lie outside our control. When you feel lonely, you're essentially saying, "I need someone else to behave in a certain way for me to feel complete." You're making your emotional well-being dependent on variables you cannot control. Aloneness, by contrast, is rooted in autonomy. It's the recognition that your peace, your contentment, your sense of purpose don't require external validation or participation. It's not that you don't value relationships or enjoy the company of others. It's that you don't need these things to feel whole. This distinction becomes clearer when you examine the quality of your thoughts in each state. When you're lonely, your thoughts tend to spiral inward in a destructive way. You think about what you lack, who isn't calling you, what you're missing out on. Your attention becomes fixated on absence, on the gaps in your life, rather than its substance. When you're alone, but not lonely, your thoughts expand outward. You notice things you miss when you're constantly engaged with others. The way light moves across a wall throughout the day, the subtle changes in your own emotional landscape, the ideas that emerge when your mind isn't busy responding to external stimuli. Your attention becomes more refined, more nuanced, more attuned to subtleties that require quiet to perceive. Psychologists have identified this distinction in their research on attachment styles and emotional regulation. People with secure attachment patterns, those who feel fundamentally safe and worthy of love, can tolerate and even enjoy solitude because they carry a sense of connection within themselves. Their self-worth isn't contingent on constant external reinforcement, but those with anxious or avoidant attachment patterns often struggle with aloneness because they haven't developed what psychologists call internal working models of security. They haven't learned to be a reliable source of comfort and validation for themselves. They outsource these essential functions to others, which makes solitude feel threatening rather than nourishing. The journey from loneliness to aloneness is essentially the journey of learning to become good company for yourself. It's the process of developing an internal relationship that is so stable, so satisfying, that external relationships become enhancements to your life rather than requirements for it. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others or withdrawing from human connection. The paradox of true aloneness is that it actually makes you more capable of genuine intimacy. When you're not desperately seeking someone else to complete you, you're free to connect with others from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. Your relationships become choices rather than dependencies. The Stoic philosopher Seneca captured this beautifully when he wrote, "It is likely that some troubles will befall us, but it is not a present fact." How often has the unexpected happened? How often has the expected never come to pass? He understood that much of our loneliness comes from projecting our fears about the future or dwelling on disappointments from the past. Aloneness, by contrast, is firmly rooted in the present moment. When you're truly alone, not lonely but alone, you begin to notice that the present moment is remarkably full. It contains your breath, your thoughts, your sensory experience of the world around you, your capacity for reflection and choice. It contains, in fact, everything you need to feel alive and engaged. The shift from loneliness to aloneness often happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. You might notice it first in small moments, sitting in a cafe by yourself and realizing you're genuinely enjoying the experience, not just enduring it until someone joins you, or taking a walk without music or podcasts and discovering that your own thoughts are interesting company. These moments of recognition are crucial because they reveal a truth that our culture works hard to obscure. You are sufficient. Not perfect, not without room for growth or connection, but sufficient. You contain within yourself everything you need to live a meaningful, engaged, purposeful life. This is perhaps the most radical idea in a world that profits from your sense of incompleteness. Every advertisement, every social media platform, every dating app operates on the assumption that you are lacking something essential, that happiness and fulfillment exist somewhere outside yourself, waiting to be acquired or attracted. But aloneness teaches you otherwise. It reveals that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one you have with yourself. It shows you that solitude isn't the absence of connection, it's the presence of self-connection. And from that foundation of internal security, all other relationships become more authentic, more generous, more genuinely loving. The choice, then, is always yours. You can experience solitude as loneliness, as evidence of what you lack, what you're missing, what you need someone else to provide. Or you can experience it as aloneness, as evidence of your completeness, your capacity for self-reflection, your freedom to be exactly who you are, without performance or pretense. One path leads to dependency and suffering. The other leads to sovereignty and peace. The difference lies not in your circumstances, but in your understanding of what it means to be truly, magnificently alone. Silence has a way of summoning ghosts, not the supernatural kind, but the emotional remnants of moments when you felt most alone, most rejected, most fundamentally unworthy of love. These memories don't announce themselves politely. They arrive unscheduled, uninvited, carrying with them the full weight of every time someone important to you walked away. You're sitting quietly, perhaps finally beginning to appreciate the peace of solitude, when suddenly you're 7 years old again, watching your father pack his suitcase. Or you're 12, eating lunch alone in the school cafeteria while your former best friend laughs with someone else. Or you're 25, staring at your phone, waiting for a text that never comes from someone who promised they'd never leave. These moments, these echoes of abandonment, don't operate according to logic or linear time. They exist in what psychologists call emotional memory, a part of your brain that doesn't distinguish between past and present, between what happened years ago and what's happening right now. When you're alone and quiet, these memories rise to the surface like bodies of water seeking their own level. The irony is cruel. The very state that could heal you, solitude, becomes contaminated by the wounds that solitude helped create. The child who was left alone too often, who learned that being by yourself meant being unwanted, grows into an adult who can't distinguish between chosen solitude and imposed isolation. This is where the philosophical meets the deeply personal. The Stoics, for all their wisdom about emotional self-regulation, lived in a time when the psychological impact of early attachment trauma wasn't well understood. They could teach you to accept what you cannot control, but they couldn't explain why some people struggle more than others to find peace in their own company. Modern psychology fills in this gap. We now understand that your capacity for healthy solitude is largely shaped by your earliest experiences of being cared for or not cared for. If your caregivers were consistently present, attuned, and responsive, you likely developed what psychologists call a secure base, an internal sense that you are worthy of love and that the world is fundamentally safe. But if your early experiences were marked by inconsistency, neglect, or abandonment, you may have developed what attachment theorists call an anxious or disorganized attachment style. In these cases, being alone doesn't feel like a peaceful return to yourself. It feels like being dropped into an emotional minefield where every step might trigger an explosion of remembered pain. The echo of abandonment is particularly cruel because it's often invisible to others. You might appear to be functioning perfectly well in social situations, charming and engaged and seemingly confident. But when the lights go out and the voices fade, you're left with the raw data of your earliest emotional experiences. The feeling that love is conditional, that safety is temporary, that being alone is evidence of being unlovable. These aren't rational thoughts that you can simply argue yourself out of. They're somatic memories stored in your nervous system that create physiological responses to solitude. Your heart rate might increase, your breathing might become shallow, you might feel a familiar knot in your stomach, a tightness in your chest, a restless energy that makes sitting still feel impossible. The French existentialist Simone de Beauvoir wrote about this phenomenon in her exploration of women's psychological development. She observed how early experiences of powerlessness and abandonment could create what she called bad faith, a fundamental mistrust of one's own capacity for autonomous existence. The abandoned child, she argued, learns to see themselves through the eyes of others who found them insufficient, carrying this external judgment as an internal truth. But here's what's remarkable about confronting these echoes. They lose their power when they're witnessed with compassion rather than judgment. The memories that terrorize you in isolation often begin to heal when you can sit with them without trying to push them away or fix them or analyze them to death. This is where the Stoic practice of negative visualization intersects with modern trauma therapy in surprising ways. Both approaches recognize that healing often requires moving toward difficulty rather than away from it. The Stoics would imagine loss and hardship not to torture themselves, but to build resilience and acceptance. Trauma therapists guide clients to stay present with difficult emotions long enough for the nervous system to learn that these feelings, however intense, are survivable. When you're alone and the echo of abandonment surfaces, you have a choice. You can respond with the same panic and avoidance that the abandoned child once used to protect themselves. You can reach for your phone, turn on the television, call someone, do anything to escape the feeling. This response is understandable. It served you once, when you were small and truly powerless. But you also have another option. You can stay. You can breathe through the discomfort and remind yourself that you are no longer the powerless child who was abandoned. You are an adult with resources, with choices, with the capacity to care for yourself in ways that weren't available to you then. This staying isn't passive. It's one of the most active, courageous things you can do. It requires what therapists call dual awareness, the ability to feel the echo of old pain while simultaneously remembering that you're safe in the present moment. It's the practice of being both the wounded child and the protective adult, holding space for both experiences without being overwhelmed by either. The echo of abandonment often carries messages that feel absolutely true in the moment. You're too much. You're not enough. If people really knew you, they'd leave. You're only valuable when you're useful to someone else. These messages feel true because they were true once in the context of relationships with people who were themselves wounded and limited in their capacity to love. But the powerful thing about confronting these echoes in solitude is that you begin to hear them as echoes rather than as current reality. You start to recognize them as old voices playing old scripts rather than as accurate assessments of your present worth or future prospects. Sometimes, in the deepest moments of solitary reflection, you might even feel gratitude for these wounds. Not because the pain was necessary or deserved, but because the process of healing them teaches you something profound about resilience, about the human capacity to transform suffering into wisdom. The abandoned child within you taught you to be self-reliant, to pay attention to emotional subtleties, to develop empathy for others who struggle with connection. These aren't consolation prizes, they're real strengths that emerged from real pain. The echo of abandonment, when faced with courage and compassion, can become the foundation for a different kind of strength. The strength that comes from knowing you can survive anything, even the loss of love. This is why solitude, despite its challenges, remains essential for healing. Only in the quiet can you hear these echoes clearly enough to distinguish between past and present, between the voice of wounded memory and the voice of current wisdom. Only in aloneness can you practice being both the one who was hurt and the one who can provide comfort, learning to love yourself with the consistency that was missing from your earliest experiences. The echo fades, not when you silence it, but when you listen to it with the compassion that transforms all wounds, the compassion that says, you were hurt, and that hurt was real, but it doesn't define what's possible for you now. From the moment you could understand language, you absorbed a story about what it means to be alone. It wasn't explicitly taught, like mathematics or history, but it was transmitted through 1,000 subtle messages, cultural assumptions, and social rituals that shaped your understanding of solitude long before you had the philosophical tools to question them. The story goes like this. Successful people are surrounded by others. Popular people always have plans. Happy people have partners, best friends, social circles that validate their worth through constant engagement. To be alone, according to this narrative, is to have failed at the fundamental human task of being lovable enough to attract and maintain companionship. This story is so pervasive, so woven into the fabric of how we measure human worth, that most people never think to question it. They simply accept that solitude is evidence of social failure, that choosing to be alone is antisocial, that enjoying your own company is slightly pathological, a sign that you're either too weird to connect with others or too wounded to try. Consider the language we use. Loner, hermit, antisocial. These aren't neutral descriptors. They're subtle indictments, suggestions that someone who spends time alone is somehow deficient in the skills or qualities that make social connection possible. Even more telling is what we call people who are rarely alone. Popular, well-connected, social butterflies. The positive valence is unmistakable. This linguistic framework creates what philosophers call a conceptual prison, a way of thinking that limits what seems possible or desirable. If solitude is inherently negative and social engagement is inherently positive, then choosing to be alone becomes an act of self-harm, a settling for less than what life could offer. But this framework is neither universal nor inevitable. It's a cultural construct shaped by specific historical and economic forces that have little to do with human well-being and everything to do with social control and economic productivity. The modern pathologizing of solitude emerged alongside industrialization and urbanization. In agricultural societies, periods of solitary work, tending animals, working fields, crafting goods, were natural and necessary parts of life. People expected and valued time alone, understanding it as essential for reflection, creativity, and spiritual development. But industrial capitalism required a different kind of human being, one who could work cooperatively in factories, consume goods socially, and define their worth through external productivity and social status. Solitude became suspect because it represented time when people weren't producing, consuming, or reinforcing the social structures that kept the economic machine running smoothly. The rise of psychology as a discipline, while valuable in many ways, also contributed to the problematizing of solitude. Early psychological theories focused heavily on social adjustment as a marker of mental health. To be well-adjusted meant to fit comfortably into social norms, to seek and maintain relationships, to find fulfillment through connection with others. Anyone who preferred solitude was seen as maladjusted, possibly narcissistic, potentially dangerous. This perspective ignored entire philosophical traditions, from ancient hermits to contemplative monks to transcendentalist thinkers, that understood solitude as a path to wisdom, creativity, and spiritual insight. It dismissed the possibility that some people might be naturally more introverted, more contemplative, more nourished by internal reflection than by external stimulation. The Stoics would have found this cultural bias against solitude puzzling and destructive. They understood that the highest human achievements, wisdom, virtue, inner peace, required periods of withdrawal from social opinion and social pressure. Seneca wrote extensively about the need to retreat from the crowd in order to think clearly, to examine one's own motivations, to develop the kind of self-knowledge that makes genuine virtue possible. But perhaps most damaging is how this anti-solitude bias affects your internal relationship with yourself. If you've internalized the message that being alone is evidence of failure, then every moment of solitude becomes a confirmation of your inadequacy. Instead of using quiet time for reflection, creativity, or rest, you spend it cataloging your social failures, wondering what's wrong with you, feeling ashamed of your own company. This creates a vicious cycle. The more uncomfortable you feel in solitude, the more desperately you seek social connection. But desperate connection is rarely authentic connection. You end up in relationships and social situations that don't truly nourish you, maintained primarily to avoid the discomfort of being alone. You begin to see other people not as individuals to connect with genuinely, but as solutions to the problem of your own solitude. The irony is profound. A culture that claims to value connection has created conditions that make genuine connection nearly impossible. When being alone feels like punishment, people approach relationships from a place of neediness rather than wholeness. They seek others to fill internal voids rather than to share internal abundance. The very fear of solitude that our culture promotes actually undermines the authentic connection it claims to celebrate. Social media has amplified these dynamics exponentially. Platforms that promise connection actually increase feelings of loneliness and social inadequacy because they present a curated version of everyone else's social life while you're experiencing your own inner reality unfiltered. You see others' highlight reels, their parties, their partnerships, their professional successes, while feeling the weight of your own doubts, fears, and ordinary moments. The constant connectivity that technology promises has created what sociologists call alone together, the experience of being physically present with others but emotionally isolated, everyone staring at their screens, seeking connection everywhere except with the people right in front of them. This pseudo-connection makes genuine solitude even more threatening because it suggests that even when you're with others, you might still be alone. But what if the entire premise is wrong? What if solitude isn't a problem to be solved, but a resource to be cultivated? What if the ability to be genuinely comfortable in your own company is actually a sign of psychological health rather than social failure? The research on creativity consistently shows that breakthrough insights most often occur during periods of solitude and reflection. The research on leadership suggests that the most effective leaders are those who can make decisions independently without needing constant external validation. The research on happiness indicates that people with a strong sense of self, independent of social approval, are more resilient, more generous, and more capable of intimate relationships. In other words, the very qualities that our culture associates with social failure, comfort with solitude, independence from others' opinions, self-sufficiency, are actually predictors of success, creativity, and psychological well-being. The punishment narrative around solitude serves particular interests, but it doesn't serve yours. It keeps you dependent on external validation, constantly seeking approval, afraid to trust your own judgment or enjoy your own company. It makes you a more predictable consumer, a more compliant employee, a more manageable citizen, but it doesn't make you happier, wiser, or more authentically connected to others. Breaking free from this narrative requires recognizing it as a story rather than a truth. It requires understanding that your worth isn't determined by how many people want to spend time with you, but by how fully you can inhabit your own life. It requires seeing solitude not as evidence of social failure, but as an opportunity for the kind of deep self-knowledge that makes all other relationships more authentic and more generous. The punishment narrative dissolves when you realize that you are not being punished by solitude. You are being liberated by it. Liberated from the exhausting need to perform for others, from the constant anxiety about social approval, from the fear that your worth depends on someone else's assessment of your value. In that liberation, something remarkable happens. You become truly free to connect with others from a place of choice rather than need, abundance rather than scarcity, love rather than fear. And that kind of connection, the kind that emerges from genuine solitude, is worth infinitely more than the desperate togetherness that our culture mistakes for love. There's a precise moment when everything changes. Not dramatically, not with fanfare or sudden revelation, but with something quieter and more profound. The simple decision to stop moving away from yourself and start moving toward yourself instead. It might happen on a Thursday afternoon when you realize you've been checking your phone every 30 seconds, not because you're expecting anything important, but because the alternative, sitting with your own thoughts, has become unbearable. Or it might come on a Sunday evening when you catch yourself making plans you don't really want to make with people you don't particularly enjoy, simply to avoid spending another evening alone. Whatever the trigger, the moment arrives when you recognize that you've been running from something that isn't actually chasing you. You've been fleeing from solitude as if it were a predator, when in fact it's been waiting patiently for you to discover that it's not your enemy, it's your teacher. This recognition doesn't feel triumphant. It feels more like exhaustion, like the moment when a person who has been carrying a heavy load for miles finally sets it down and realizes they don't remember why they picked it up in the first place. The relief is immediate, but so is the strange sense of disorientation that comes with stopping a motion that has defined you for so long. The running takes many forms. There's the obvious kind, the constant social activity, the inability to eat a meal alone, the panic that sets in when you don't have plans for the weekend. But there are subtler forms too. The mental running that keeps your mind constantly occupied with problems to solve, content to consume, other people's lives to analyze and compare yourself to. You might have convinced yourself that this constant motion was productivity, that staying busy was the same as living fully. But in the moment you stop running, you realize that much of what you've been calling living has actually been a sophisticated form of avoidance. You've been so afraid of what you might discover in stillness that you've chosen the exhaustion of perpetual motion over the unknown territory of your own inner landscape. The Stoics had a phrase for this recognition: the view from above. They practiced imagining themselves from a cosmic perspective, seeing their lives and concerns in the context of infinite space and time. This wasn't meant to diminish the importance of human experience, but to provide clarity about what truly matters and what is merely the noise of ego and social conditioning. When you stop running, you get your own version of this cosmic perspective. You see how much energy you've been spending on things that don't actually nourish you, how much of your life has been shaped by fear rather than choice, how much of your identity has been constructed in reaction to other people's expectations rather than in response to your own authentic impulses. This seeing can be uncomfortable at first. It's like walking from a brightly lit room into natural sunlight. Your eyes need time to adjust before you can appreciate the broader spectrum of colors available to you. In the harsh light of honest self-examination, you might discover that many of the things you thought you wanted were actually things you thought you should want. Many of the people you thought you needed were actually people you were using to avoid facing yourself. But this discomfort is productive discomfort. It's the discomfort of growth, of shedding old patterns that no longer serve you, of making space for something more authentic to emerge. It's the discomfort that a butterfly might feel as it dissolves in the chrysalis, not knowing what it will become, but trusting the process of transformation. The moment you stop running is often triggered by what psychologists call ego fatigue. The exhaustion that comes from constantly managing your image, constantly performing the version of yourself that you think others want to see. This performance requires enormous amounts of energy because it's essentially living a lie, and lies are always more work to maintain than truth. When you finally stop, you discover something remarkable. The self you've been running from isn't the monster you imagined it to be. Yes, there are parts of you that are messy, complicated, still wounded from old experiences. But there are also parts that are wise, creative, genuinely funny, capable of surprising insight and unexpected compassion. There are aspects of your personality that only emerge in solitude, qualities that can't be accessed when you're constantly responding to external stimuli. This is where the philosophical rubber meets the road. The Stoics taught that wisdom begins with self-knowledge, but self-knowledge is impossible if you're never alone with yourself long enough to discover who you actually are beneath all the roles you play and masks you wear. Existentialist philosophers like Sartre and Camus understood this stopping as essential to authentic existence. They recognized that most people live what they called inauthentic lives. Lives shaped by social pressure, cultural expectations, and the opinions of others rather than by their own deep values and genuine desires. The moment you stop running is the moment you begin to reclaim your authenticity. But this authenticity isn't something you find, it's something you create through the choices you make when no one else is watching. It emerges through the daily practice of choosing solitude over distraction, depth over busyness, your own inner wisdom over the noise of external opinions. The stopping isn't permanent in the sense that you never again seek the company of others or engage in social activities. Rather, it's a fundamental shift in your relationship to these things. You begin to choose connection from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. Engage socially because you want to, rather than because you're afraid not to. When you stop running from solitude, you also stop running toward things that can't actually give you what you're seeking. You stop looking for other people to validate your worth, for achievements to prove your value, for experiences to fill the void that you now understand was never actually empty, it was just unexamined. This is perhaps the most profound shift of all. The recognition that the void you've been trying to fill doesn't exist. What you thought was emptiness was actually fullness that you hadn't learned to recognize. What you thought was loneliness was actually the presence of yourself, a presence you'd never been still enough to appreciate. In this moment of stopping, you begin to understand what the mystics and philosophers have been pointing toward for millennia. That you are already whole, already complete, already sufficient. Not perfect, not without room for growth or connection, but fundamentally okay, just as you are, right now, in this moment. The running ends not because you've reached some destination, but because you've realized you were never actually going anywhere. You were just moving away from the only place where real peace, real wisdom, real love could ever be found. Right here in the irreplaceable presence of your own being. And in that stillness, something new becomes possible. Not the desperate grasping for connection that characterized your running years, but a gentle opening to whatever wants to emerge, whether that's deeper solitude, authentic relationship, creative expression, or simply the quiet satisfaction of being fully present in your own life. The moment you stop running is the moment you begin to arrive. And arrival, you discover, feels nothing like punishment. It feels like coming home to yourself after a long, exhausting journey through foreign territory. It feels like the end of exile and the beginning of something you didn't even know you'd been seeking. The profound peace of being genuinely, completely, unapologetically alone with yourself, and finding that you are, in fact, excellent company. In the 3rd century, a Roman emperor sat alone in his tent on the Germanic frontier, writing words that would outlive empires. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, understood something that most people spend their entire lives trying to learn: that true strength comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from building an unassailable fortress within your own mind. He called this fortress the inner citadel, a psychological sanctuary that no external force could breach, no loss could diminish, no criticism could penetrate. It wasn't built of stone and mortar, but of principles and practices, of disciplined thinking and deliberate choice, and it could only be constructed in solitude. When you begin to understand solitude through the lens of Stoic philosophy, everything changes. What once felt like vulnerability becomes recognizable as the very foundation of true invincibility. What seemed like isolation reveals itself as the only space where genuine autonomy can be cultivated. The time you spend alone stops being time you're enduring and becomes time you're investing. investing in the construction of something that no one can take from you. The Stoics understood that most human suffering comes from a fundamental confusion about what we can and cannot control. We exhaust ourselves trying to control other people's opinions, external outcomes, the weather, the economy, the behavior of those we love. But these things exist outside our sphere of influence, and any happiness that depends on them is inherently fragile. The inner citadel, by contrast, is built entirely from materials that are within your control: your thoughts, your responses, your values, your choices in each moment. It's constructed from what the Stoics called the faculty of choice, your ability to decide how you will interpret events, what meaning you will assign to experiences, how you will respond to whatever life presents. This fortress cannot be built in company. It requires the kind of honest self-examination that only happens when you're alone with your thoughts, stripped of the distractions and opinions that usually influence your thinking. In solitude, you can assess your own mental patterns without the pressure to appear reasonable to others. You can identify the thoughts that serve you and those that don't, the beliefs that strengthen you and those that make you dependent on circumstances beyond your control. Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations, never intending them to be read by others. They were exercises in building and maintaining his inner citadel, practices designed to keep his thinking clear and his responses aligned with his values regardless of external pressures. Reading them now, you can see the daily work of fortress building, reminding himself that other people's opinions don't determine his worth, that loss and gain are equally temporary, that his peace depends entirely on how he chooses to think about his circumstances. "You have power over your mind, not outside events," he wrote. "Realize this and you will find strength." This wasn't positive thinking or self-help platitudes. This was the recognition that your inner experience is the only domain where you have complete sovereignty, and that sovereignty must be claimed and maintained through conscious effort. The construction of your inner citadel begins with what cognitive psychologists now call cognitive reframing, the practice of consciously choosing how to interpret events rather than accepting your first emotional reaction as truth. When you're alone and something triggers anxiety, anger, or sadness, you have the opportunity to pause and ask, what story am I telling myself about this situation? Is this story helpful? Is it true? What other interpretations are possible? This isn't about denying reality or forcing false optimism. It's about recognizing that reality itself is largely neutral. It's the meaning you assign to events that creates your emotional experience. A rejection letter can be evidence that you're not good enough, or it can be information about fit, timing, or the subjective preferences of one person. A cancelled plan can be proof that people don't value your time, or it can be an unexpected gift of solitude. The facts remain the same. The fortress is built from choosing interpretations that serve your peace and growth, rather than those that reinforce your fears and insecurities. The Stoics also understood that building this fortress requires what they called prosoche, continuous attention to your own mental state. This means developing the habit of observing your thoughts without being overwhelmed by them, of noticing your emotional reactions without being controlled by them. In solitude, you can practice this self-observation without the complexity of also managing social dynamics or performing for others. You begin to notice patterns, how certain thoughts tend to spiral into anxiety, how particular triggers reliably produce anger, how specific memories can shift your mood from contentment to despair. But you also begin to notice something more important: the space between trigger and response, the moment where choice becomes possible. This space, what Viktor Frankl called the last of human freedoms, is where your fortress becomes most practical. In that pause between stimulus and response, you can choose thoughts that align with your values rather than defaulting to conditioned reactions. You can ask yourself what the strongest, wisest version of yourself would do in this situation, and then choose to act from that place regardless of how you feel in the moment. The inner citadel isn't built overnight. Like any fortress, it requires consistent maintenance, daily reinforcement, constant vigilance against the forces that would breach its walls. The forces aren't external enemies. They're the habitual thought patterns that keep you dependent on circumstances, the emotional reactions that make you feel powerless, the beliefs that convince you that your peace depends on other people's behavior. But as you build this fortress through solitary practice, something remarkable happens. You become genuinely independent, not antisocial or isolated, but free to engage with the world from a position of strength rather than need. Your relationships improve because you're no longer desperately seeking validation from others. Your work becomes more creative because you're less afraid of failure or criticism. Your choices become more authentic because they're based on your own values rather than on what you think will win approval. The Stoics had a beautiful concept called amor fati, love of fate, which meant learning to not just accept whatever happens, but to embrace it as exactly what was needed for your growth. This attitude can only be cultivated in the solitary moments when you're working with your own reactions to events, learning to find the opportunity in every obstacle, the lesson in every disappointment. Marcus Aurelius faced plagues, wars, betrayals, and the constant pressure of ruling an empire. But in the quiet moments of reflection, alone with his thoughts, he built something that made him unshakable: the knowledge that his peace didn't depend on any of these external circumstances. It depended only on his ability to choose his response, to align his thinking with reality rather than with his preferences, to find strength in accepting what he couldn't control and taking responsibility for what he could. Your circumstances may be different, but the principle remains the same. In the solitude that you once feared, you have the opportunity to build something that no external force can touch. A mind that is truly your own, a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, a strength that grows stronger through adversity rather than weaker. The fortress within isn't a place of withdrawal from the world. It's the foundation that makes genuine engagement with the world possible. When you know that your essential well-being doesn't depend on outcomes, you become free to act with courage, compassion, and authenticity. When you understand that no one else's opinion can diminish your worth, you become free to express yourself honestly and take creative risks. The emperor who built his inner citadel on the German frontier understood something that modern culture has largely forgotten: that true power has nothing to do with controlling others and everything to do with mastering yourself. And that mastery, that sovereignty, that unshakable peace, it can only be built in the sanctuary of your own solitude. The fortress is waiting to be built. The materials are all within your control. The only question is whether you'll use your time alone to construct something unshakable, or to continue trying to build your happiness on the shifting sands of external circumstances. Choose the fortress. Your future self will thank you for it. There's a voice in your head that never stops talking. It comments on everything you do, evaluates every interaction, rehearses conversations that haven't happened yet, and replays ones that went poorly. For most people, this voice is not a friend. It's a critic, a worrier, a harsh judge that seems to have memorized every mistake you've ever made and delights in reminding you of them at the worst possible moments. In solitude, this voice becomes impossible to ignore. When there are no external conversations to distract you, no other people's voices to drown it out, your internal dialogue moves from background noise to center stage. And for many people, this is precisely why solitude feels unbearable. They're trapped in a room with someone who doesn't seem to like them very much. But here's what most people don't realize. That voice isn't you. It's a collection of internalized messages, learned patterns, and automatic responses that have been running unchecked for so long that you've forgotten they can be changed. The critical inner voice feels permanent and authoritative, but it's actually neither. It's simply a habit of thinking that can be examined, questioned, and ultimately transformed. The Stoics understood this principle with remarkable sophistication. They recognized that thoughts are not facts, that the first story your mind tells about any situation is rarely the most helpful one, and that true freedom comes from learning to direct your internal dialogue rather than being directed by it. Epictetus, who spent years as a slave before becoming one of philosophy's great teachers, put it simply: "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." This reaction begins with the voice in your head, the immediate interpretation, the automatic assumption, the habitual way you talk to yourself about what's happening. Change the voice, and you change the experience. Cognitive behavioral therapy has validated what the Stoics knew intuitively: that our emotional responses are largely determined by our thought patterns, and these patterns can be identified, challenged, and replaced with more helpful alternatives. The process requires the kind of careful self-observation that only becomes possible in solitude, when you can notice your thoughts without the pressure of responding to external demands. In quiet moments, you begin to recognize the difference between thoughts that serve you and thoughts that sabotage you. The voice that says, "I can't handle this," creates a very different emotional reality than the voice that says, "This is challenging, but I've handled challenges before." The voice that interprets a mistake as evidence of fundamental inadequacy produces different outcomes than the voice that frames the same mistake as information for improvement. The reclamation of your internal dialogue begins with becoming aware of its current patterns. In solitude, you can practice what psychologists call metacognition, thinking about your thinking. You can observe the voice in your head with the same detached curiosity you might bring to studying a fascinating but complex piece of machinery. What does this voice tend to focus on? Does it ruminate about past mistakes or worry about future problems? Does it compare you unfavorably to others or set impossibly high standards that guarantee failure? Does it catastrophize minor setbacks or minimize genuine achievements? These patterns aren't random. They were learned, often early in life, as responses to specific circumstances that may no longer be relevant. The critical inner voice often develops as a protective mechanism. The child who was frequently criticized learns to criticize themselves first, hoping to avoid external judgment. The person who experienced unpredictable rejection learns to reject themselves preemptively, maintaining the illusion of control over painful outcomes. The individual who was praised only for achievements develops an internal taskmaster that never allows rest or satisfaction. But protection mechanisms that served you at one stage of life can become prisons at another. The voice that once helped you navigate a critical environment may now be preventing you from taking necessary risks, expressing authentic opinions, or enjoying well-earned successes. Recognition of this shift is the beginning of transformation. The Stoic practice of reframing provides a practical tool for changing your internal dialogue. Instead of accepting your first thought about a situation, you can ask, what would be a more helpful way to think about this? What would I tell a good friend who was facing this challenge? What perspective would give me more power to respond effectively? This isn't about forcing false positivity or denying genuine problems. It's about recognizing that most situations can be interpreted in multiple ways, and choosing interpretations that enhance your ability to respond wisely rather than react emotionally. The facts remain the same, but the meaning you assign to them, and therefore your emotional experience of them, can shift dramatically. For example, the voice that says, "I'm terrible at public speaking," creates anxiety and avoidance. But that same experience could be reframed as, "I'm learning to communicate more effectively," or "I feel nervous because this matters to me," or "Each time I speak publicly, I build confidence for the next time." The external situation hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has been transformed. In solitude, you can also practice what the Stoics called negative visualization, deliberately imagining loss or failure not to torture yourself, but to build resilience and appreciation. The voice that catastrophizes uncontrollably can be retrained to consider difficulties calmly and prepare for them practically. Instead of, "What if everything goes wrong?" you can cultivate, "If this challenge arises, how will I respond? What resources do I have available? What would I learn from this experience?" The process of reclaiming your internal dialogue also involves developing what psychologists call self-compassion, the ability to speak to yourself with the same kindness you would offer a good friend. Many people have an internal voice that is far harsher than they would ever be toward others. They accept a level of self-criticism that they would recognize as abusive if it came from another person. Self-compassion doesn't mean lowering standards or avoiding accountability. It means recognizing that motivation doesn't require self-attack, that learning doesn't require self-punishment, that growth is more likely to occur in an environment of encouragement than in one of constant criticism. The voice that says, "I'm disappointed in myself, but I'm committed to doing better," is far more effective than the voice that says, "I'm a failure who never learns." The transformation of internal dialogue is gradual, like learning any new skill. You catch the old patterns, pause, and consciously choose different words. You practice new ways of talking to yourself about challenges, setbacks, and uncertainties. Over time, these new patterns become as automatic as the old ones, but they serve your growth rather than undermining it. Marcus Aurelius demonstrated this practice in his Meditations, constantly redirecting his internal dialogue toward more helpful perspectives. When he felt overwhelmed by his responsibilities, he reminded himself that he had been placed in his position to serve others. When he was tempted to be frustrated by difficult people, he reframed their behavior as opportunities to practice patience and wisdom. When he faced setbacks, he viewed them as tests of his philosophical principles. The emperor's private writings reveal a man actively working to align his internal dialogue with his values rather than his emotions. He spoke to himself with the voice of a wise teacher rather than a harsh critic, consistently choosing thoughts that enhanced his ability to respond to challenges with virtue and clarity. In your own solitude, you have the same opportunity. You can become the author of your internal dialogue rather than its victim. You can choose thoughts that strengthen your resilience, enhance your creativity, and support your authentic expression. You can develop an inner voice that functions as a wise mentor rather than a harsh judge. The voice in your head will never stop talking, but it doesn't have to remain the enemy. With conscious effort and consistent practice, it can become your greatest ally, a source of encouragement, wisdom, and strength that travels with you wherever you go. In the solitude that once felt like exile, you can cultivate the companionship of your own transformed mind. And that companionship, once established, makes every other relationship in your life more authentic, more generous, and more genuinely loving. When you've learned to speak to yourself with kindness and wisdom, you naturally extend that same quality of attention to others. The voice becomes not just an ally, but a teacher, teaching you, through your own transformed internal dialogue, how to offer the world the gift of thoughtful, compassionate, empowering communication. It starts in the silence, with the courage to listen to yourself with new ears. In the stark clarity of solitude, all your excuses dissolve. There's no one else to blame for your reactions, no external circumstances to hide behind, no audience to perform for or against. You're left with the most liberating and terrifying truth in human existence. You are completely responsible for your response to everything that happens to you. This isn't the kind of responsibility that burdens you with guilt for things beyond your control. It's radical responsibility, the recognition that while you cannot control what happens to you, you have absolute sovereignty over what you do with what happens to you. This distinction, simple as it sounds, is the foundation of all genuine personal power. The Stoics called this principle the dichotomy of control, and they considered it the cornerstone of philosophy. Epictetus taught his students to begin each day by clearly distinguishing between what is up to us and what is not up to us. Everything in the first category, your thoughts, judgments, desires, and actions, is within your complete control. Everything in the second category, other people's behavior, external events, outcomes of your efforts, is outside your influence and therefore not your responsibility. This sounds obvious until you examine how much of your mental energy you spend trying to control things that aren't actually up to you. You worry about what others think of you, stress about economic conditions, feel anxious about your loved one's choices, get frustrated when people don't respond the way you want them to. All of this mental activity is not just ineffective, it's a form of spiritual exile from your own power. Solitude strips away the illusions that keep you focused on the wrong sphere of influence. When you're alone with your thoughts, you can't pretend that your anxiety is caused by your circumstances rather than your interpretation of your circumstances. You can't blame your mood on other people's behavior when there's no one else around. You're forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that your emotional experience is largely self-created. This confrontation is initially destabilizing. Most people have built their identity around their reactions to external events, their stories about how the world has shaped them, their explanations for why they are the way they are. To accept radical responsibility means dismantling these familiar narratives and acknowledging that you have far more power than you've been willing to claim. The existentialist philosophers understood this dynamic with piercing clarity. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that humans are condemned to be free, that consciousness itself creates an inescapable responsibility for choosing how to interpret and respond to experience. Every moment presents you with options, and every choice you make defines who you are becoming. There is no escape from this freedom, no external authority that can make your choices for you. This freedom can feel overwhelming when you first encounter it fully. If you're responsible for your responses, then you can't blame your parents for your insecurities, your culture for your limitations, your circumstances for your lack of progress. You have to acknowledge that you've been choosing your reactions all along, even when those choices felt automatic or involuntary. But this apparent burden is actually the source of all genuine empowerment. If you're responsible for your responses, then you have the power to change them. If your experience is largely self-created, then you can create different experiences by making different choices. The same recognition that initially feels like a weight becomes the key to unprecedented freedom. In solitude, you can practice what the Stoics called the discipline of desire, learning to want what happens rather than demanding that what you want should happen. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting injustice, but rather focusing your energy on areas where you can actually make a difference rather than exhausting yourself fighting reality. When you take radical responsibility for your internal experience, external circumstances lose their power to control your peace. A traffic jam becomes an opportunity to practice patience rather than a personal affront. A rejection becomes information about fit rather than evidence of inadequacy. A disappointment becomes a chance to demonstrate resilience rather than proof that life is unfair. This shift in perspective requires what psychologists call internal locus of control, the recognition that your outcomes are primarily determined by your own actions and choices rather than by external forces. Research consistently shows that people with internal locus of control are more successful, more resilient, and more satisfied with their lives than those who feel controlled by external circumstances. But developing this internal orientation requires time alone with your own decision-making process. You need to observe how you actually make choices, what factors influence your decisions, what patterns of thinking lead to what kinds of outcomes. This self-examination is impossible when you're constantly responding to external demands or seeking input from others about what you should do. Radical responsibility also means taking ownership of your own development. Instead of waiting for someone else to motivate you, teach you, or give you permission to pursue your goals, you recognize that your growth is your responsibility. Instead of hoping that external circumstances will change to make your life easier, you focus on building the skills and mindset that allow you to thrive regardless of circumstances. This doesn't mean rejecting help when it's offered or pretending that systemic inequalities don't exist. It means recognizing that even in difficult circumstances, you have choices about how to respond, what to focus on, what meaning to assign to your experiences. Viktor Frankl, writing from his experience in Nazi concentration camps, argued that this freedom to choose your response is the one thing that can never be taken from you, no matter how extreme your circumstances. In solitude, you can also examine the ways you've been giving away your power through victim narratives, blame, and the belief that you're helpless to change your situation. These mental patterns often develop as protective mechanisms. It can feel safer to believe that you're powerless than to acknowledge that you have choices that you've been afraid to make. But protection that comes from disowning your power is ultimately self-defeating. It may shield you from the anxiety of responsibility, but it also cuts you off from your capacity to create meaningful change in your life. Radical responsibility means choosing empowerment over protection, growth over comfort, authentic living over safe passivity. The practice of radical responsibility transforms your relationship to problems. Instead of seeing challenges as things that happen to you, you begin to see them as opportunities to exercise and develop your capacity for wise response. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you start asking, "How can I respond to this in a way that aligns with my values and serves my growth?" This shift doesn't eliminate difficulties or guarantee easy solutions, but it places you in a fundamentally different relationship to whatever arises in your life. You move from being a victim of circumstances to being an agent of response. You stop waiting for life to treat you better and start focusing on becoming better at handling whatever life presents. Marcus Aurelius, despite facing wars, plagues, and betrayals, maintained this perspective through daily practice. In his private reflections, he consistently reminded himself that his happiness depended not on what happened to him, but on how he chose to think about and respond to what happened. He took radical responsibility for his internal experience while accepting that external events were largely beyond his control. In your own solitude, you have the opportunity to develop this same quality of response. You can examine your habitual patterns of thinking and choosing, identify areas where you've been giving away your power, and practice making decisions from a place of ownership rather than victimhood. The silence that once felt empty becomes full of possibility when you realize that you are not just observing your life. You are actively creating it through every choice you make. The time alone that felt like exile becomes a laboratory for experimenting with different ways of thinking, responding, and being in the world. Radical responsibility is ultimately radical freedom. When you stop trying to control what isn't yours to control and start fully owning what is, you discover a power that no external circumstance can diminish. You become unshakable, not because nothing difficult ever happens to you, but because you know that whatever happens, you have the capacity to respond with wisdom, courage, and integrity. In the solitude where all excuses fall away, you don't discover your limitations. You discover your unlimited capacity to choose who you become in response to whatever life brings you, and that discovery changes everything. Most people have never learned to sit still, not just physically, though that's challenging enough in our hyperactive culture, but mentally and emotionally. They've never developed the capacity to remain present with whatever arises in their consciousness without immediately needing to fix it, change it, distract from it, or escape it entirely. This inability to sit with yourself is not a character flaw. It's a skill that was never taught, a capacity that was never developed, because our entire social system is designed around constant external stimulation and reaction. But learning this art, the art of sitting with yourself, is perhaps the most important skill you can develop, because it's the foundation of all genuine peace, creativity, and wisdom. When you first attempt to sit quietly with your own thoughts and feelings without external distraction, you discover why most people avoid it. Within minutes, sometimes seconds, discomfort arises. Not just boredom, but a more fundamental unease, a restlessness that feels almost physical, an urgency to do something, anything, rather than simply be present with what is. This discomfort isn't random. It's your nervous system encountering the unfamiliar experience of not having to respond to external stimuli. For most of your life, your attention has been pulled in different directions, by other people, by entertainment, by problems to solve, by information to process. Your mind has become accustomed to this constant stimulation, and stillness feels like deprivation. But this discomfort is also where the real work begins. The Stoics understood that the capacity to remain calm in the face of internal turbulence is the cornerstone of wisdom. They called this quality ataraxia, unperturbedness, and they recognized that it could only be developed through practice, through repeatedly choosing to remain present with difficult experiences rather than fleeing from them. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this practice in his personal reflections. Confine yourself to the present. This wasn't a platitude about living in the moment. It was a disciplined practice of returning attention to what is actually happening right now, rather than getting lost in regrets about the past or anxieties about the future. It required what we now call mindfulness, the ability to observe your own mental activity without being overwhelmed by it. Modern psychology has validated what the Stoics knew intuitively, that the capacity to tolerate difficult emotions without immediately reacting is one of the strongest predictors of mental health, successful relationships, and life satisfaction. Psychologists call this skill distress tolerance, and they've developed specific techniques for building it. But these techniques all require the same fundamental practice: learning to sit with yourself when sitting with yourself is uncomfortable, learning to breathe through anxiety rather than avoiding it, to observe sadness rather than numbing it, to remain present with anger rather than immediately expressing or suppressing it. This is not about becoming emotionally numb or indifferent. It's about developing what Buddhist teachers call equanimity, the ability to remain centered and responsive rather than reactive, regardless of what you're experiencing internally. It's the difference between being tossed around by your emotions and learning to navigate through them skillfully. The practice begins simply. You sit quietly and pay attention to what happens. Thoughts arise. You notice them without judging them as good or bad. Emotions surface. You acknowledge them without immediately trying to change them. Physical sensations emerge. You observe them with curiosity rather than resistance. At first, this observation feels impossible. Your mind seems determined to drag you into every thought, to make every emotion feel urgently important, to convince you that you need to do something about whatever you're experiencing. But gradually, with practice, you begin to recognize the difference between experiencing something and being overwhelmed by it. You start to notice that thoughts are temporary events in consciousness, not permanent truths about reality. You observe that emotions, however intense, have a natural rhythm of arising and passing away. You discover that discomfort, while unpleasant, is not dangerous. It's simply information about your current state. This recognition is profoundly liberating. Most of your suffering comes not from difficult experiences themselves, but from your resistance to having those experiences. You suffer not because you feel sad, but because you judge yourself for feeling sad. You struggle not because you're anxious, but because you're anxious about being anxious. The art of sitting with yourself involves learning to drop this secondary layer of resistance. You practice allowing whatever is present to be present, without adding the extra suffering of judgment, without the exhausting effort of trying to control what you're experiencing. The Stoics had a beautiful phrase for this practice: the discipline of assent. It meant learning to choose consciously which thoughts and impressions to accept as true and important, rather than automatically believing everything that arises in your mind. When an anxious thought appears, you don't have to assent to its urgency. When a sad emotion emerges, you don't have to agree with its message about your life. This discipline can only be developed in solitude, because it requires the kind of careful attention to your internal processes that becomes impossible when you're managing external relationships and responsibilities. In quiet moments, you can practice observing your thoughts without being consumed by them, feeling your emotions without being controlled by them, The practice is like learning to swim in choppy water. At first, every wave feels threatening. Every change in conditions seems to require immediate response. But gradually, you learn to move with the water rather than fighting it, to remain buoyant regardless of the surface conditions, to trust to navigate whatever arises. This skill, the ability to sit calmly with internal turbulence, transforms every other area of your life. In relationships, you become less reactive, more able to respond to conflict from a place of clarity rather than emotional overwhelm. In work, you become more creative and focused, less driven by anxiety about outcomes. In general, you become more resilient, more present, more genuinely available to engage with life as it actually is, rather than as you wish it were. The art also involves learning to distinguish between productive and unproductive forms of mental activity. Some thoughts deserve attention because they're pointing toward important insights or necessary actions. Others are simply mental noise, repetitive loops, anxious catastrophizing, or judgmental chatter that serves no useful purpose. In solitude, you can practice what meditation teachers call noting, simply labeling mental activity as it arises. Worrying, planning, remembering, judging. This labeling creates a small space between you and your thoughts, enough space to choose whether to engage with them or let them pass. Over time, you develop what might be called mental fitness, the ability to sustain attention on what you choose to focus on, rather than being at the mercy of whatever happens to capture your mind. You become less susceptible to mental distractions, less reactive to emotional triggers, more capable of sustained reflection and creative thinking. The practice is not about achieving some state of permanent calm or eliminating all difficult emotions. It's about building the capacity to remain present and responsive regardless of what you're experiencing internally. It's about learning to trust your ability to handle whatever arises in your consciousness without losing your center. Marcus Aurelius, despite facing enormous external pressures as emperor, found his peace through this practice of sitting with himself. In his meditations, he consistently returned to the present moment, observed his reactions without being controlled by them, and chose responses that aligned with his values rather than his immediate emotions. You have access to this same practice, this same source of strength. In the solitude that you once avoided, you can develop the skill that makes all other skills more effective, the ability to remain present with yourself, whatever your internal weather might be. The art of sitting with yourself is ultimately the art of coming home to yourself. It's the recognition that you don't need external circumstances to change for you to be okay, that you don't need to fix or eliminate difficult experiences to find peace. You simply need to develop the capacity to remain present with whatever is, trusting that your essential well-being doesn't depend on the temporary contents of your consciousness. In this presence, this willingness to sit with whatever arises, you discover something that no external achievement can provide, the unshakable peace that comes from knowing you can handle anything that emerges in your own mind and heart. And that knowledge, once established, becomes the foundation for engaging with the world from a place of strength rather than need, love rather than fear, wisdom rather than reactivity. The most radical act in a world obsessed with visibility is to become powerful in private, to develop strength that doesn't announce itself, wisdom that doesn't seek recognition, character that doesn't require witnesses. This is the kind of power that the ancient Stoics prized above all others, not the power to control others, but the power to be fully yourself, regardless of who's watching. Our culture has confused power with performance. We've been taught to believe that influence requires an audience, that success demands recognition, that strength must be seen to be real. Social media has amplified this confusion exponentially, creating a world where people feel compelled to document every achievement, every insight, every moment of growth, as if these experiences don't count unless they're publicly validated. But the deepest power operates in silence. It's the power that comes from knowing who you are when no one is looking, from acting according to your values when there's no one to impress, from choosing integrity when there's no external reward for doing so. This power is invisible to others, but it's the foundation that makes all authentic expression possible. The Stoics understood that seeking external validation is a form of slavery. When your sense of worth depends on other people's opinions, you become a prisoner of their judgments, constantly adjusting your behavior to win approval or avoid criticism. You lose touch with your own values, your own instincts, your own sense of what matters. You become, in Seneca's words, a player of roles rather than a human being. True power begins with the recognition that you don't need anyone else's permission to be yourself. You don't need external validation to know your worth, external recognition to feel successful, external applause to feel proud of your efforts. These things may be pleasant when they come, but they're not necessary for your fundamental well-being. This recognition can only be cultivated in solitude, because it's only when you're alone that you can discover who you are without an audience. In the presence of others, you're always partly performing, always somewhat influenced by their expectations and reactions. But in genuine solitude, you encounter yourself unfiltered, your real thoughts, your authentic emotions, your actual values, rather than the ones you think you should have. Marcus Aurelius wrote his Meditations, never intending them to be read by others. They were exercises in developing character, in strengthening virtue, in clarifying his own thinking. He was building power without audience, cultivating wisdom and integrity for their own sake, not for recognition or reward. The fact that these private reflections became one of history's most influential philosophical works demonstrates the paradox of authentic power. The less you seek external validation, the more genuinely influential you become. In psychology, this quality is called intrinsic motivation, the drive to engage in activities because they're inherently meaningful to you, not because they lead to external rewards. Research consistently shows that people who are intrinsically motivated are more creative, more persistent, more satisfied with their lives, and ultimately more successful than those who depend primarily on external motivators like money, status, or approval. But developing intrinsic motivation requires learning to find satisfaction in the process rather than just the outcomes, in the effort rather than just the results, in the practice rather than just the performance. This shift can only happen when you spend time alone with your work, your thoughts, your creative processes, without the immediate feedback loop of external response. Consider what it means to develop a skill in private, to practice writing with no intention of publishing, to learn music with no plan to perform, to cultivate philosophical understanding with no desire to teach others. This is not about hiding your light under a bushel, but about learning to value the light itself rather than others' recognition of it. When you develop power without audience, something remarkable happens to your relationship with failure and success. Failure becomes information rather than judgment, a signal to adjust your approach rather than evidence of your inadequacy. Success becomes a natural result of aligned effort rather than the goal that defines your worth. This internal orientation also transforms your capacity for genuine connection with others. When you're not desperately seeking validation, you become free to offer authentic attention to others rather than constantly evaluating how they're responding to you. Your relationships become more generous, more present, more genuinely loving because they're not contaminated by the need to prove yourself. The Stoic concept of preferred indifference applies perfectly here. Recognition, praise, and external success are preferred. They're pleasant when they occur, but they're indifferent to your fundamental well-being and virtue. You can enjoy them when they come without depending on them for your peace, and you can accept their absence without feeling diminished. Developing this internal strength requires what the Stoics called the discipline of action, learning to act according to your principles regardless of external circumstances or potential rewards. You tell the truth, not because it will be appreciated, but because truthfulness aligns with your character. You work diligently, not because you'll be recognized, but because diligence expresses your values. You treat others with kindness, not because they'll return it, but because kindness is who you choose to be. This discipline can only be developed through practice, through repeatedly choosing principle over convenience, character over popularity, integrity over advantage. And this practice requires solitude, because it's only when you're alone that you can examine your true motivations. Notice when you're acting for show rather than from conviction, and strengthen your commitment to being the same person in private that you are in public. The power that emerges from this practice is qualitatively different from the power that depends on external validation. It's stable rather than fluctuating, internal rather than circumstantial, available rather than dependent on others' cooperation. It's the power that comes from self-knowledge, self-acceptance, and self-determination. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others or withdrawing from social engagement. Rather, it means engaging from a place of fullness rather than emptiness, offering rather than seeking, contributing rather than taking. When you have a solid foundation of internal worth, you become free to give genuinely to others without keeping score, to take risks without being paralyzed by the fear of judgment, to express yourself authentically without being attached to specific responses. The practical implications are profound. You become more creative because you're not constrained by what you think others want to see. You become more courageous because your security doesn't depend on avoiding criticism. You become more authentic because you're not exhausting yourself trying to be what you think others expect. You also become more resilient in the face of adversity. When your power comes from within rather than from external circumstances, setbacks become temporary challenges rather than fundamental threats. Loss of status, recognition, or approval may be disappointing, but it doesn't shake your foundation because your foundation isn't built on these external supports. The French philosopher Simone Weil wrote beautifully about this kind of power. The soul that is attached to something lower than itself degrades itself to the level of this thing. The soul that is attached to nothing less than itself preserves its dignity. The power without audience is the power of a soul that has learned to value itself appropriately, neither inflated by praise nor deflated by criticism, but steady in its recognition of its own inherent worth. In your solitude, you have the opportunity to cultivate this quality of power. You can practice acting according to your values when no one will know, developing skills when no one will see, making choices that align with your integrity even when there's no external reward for doing so. This is not about becoming a hermit or rejecting all social connection. It's about building a foundation of internal strength that makes all your external engagements more authentic and effective. It's about learning to be the source of your own validation so that you can offer genuine appreciation to others without needing it returned. The power without audience is ultimately the power of freedom. Freedom from the exhausting need to prove yourself. Freedom from the anxiety of depending on others' opinions. Freedom to be fully yourself, regardless of who's watching or what they think. In a world that profits from your insecurity, that depends on your need for external validation, that keeps you dancing for approval, the choice to develop power without audience is deeply subversive. It's the choice to step out of the performance and into authentic being, to stop seeking and start being, to find in yourself what you've been looking for everywhere else. The audience will come and go, the applause will start and stop, the recognition will rise and fall. But the power you build in solitude, the strength you develop in silence, the character you cultivate in private, these become your permanent possessions, the unshakable foundation of a life lived from the inside out.